All of us go about our lives believing that no matter what happens, we can always call the police, and they'll save us. But what if that belief is nothing more than a comforting lie? What if there are things so horrifying, so unimaginable, that even the police are powerless to stop them? Tonight, you'll hear stories that will shatter that illusion. A woman's haunting cries that lead officers to a house of unspeakable horror. A midnight scream in the woods that reveals a predator no one saw coming. A blood-soaked trunk with a dark, twisted secret, and the chilling truth left behind. A child's whisper, a blood-stained basement, and a killer waiting in the dark. These are the calls they'll never forget, and neither will you. I was the first to arrive on the scene. Dispatch described it as a domestic disturbance, which is usually the kind of thing you don't lose sleep over. A neighbor called it in, said she heard a woman crying in the house next door for hours, but no one answered the door. Standard stuff, right? Except when I pulled up, the house was dark. No porch light, no glow from the windows. Just an old, two-story house that looked like it had been forgotten by time. I knocked, identified myself. No response. But the crying? I heard it immediately. Faint, muffled, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the house. It wasn't just crying. It was this guttural, wrenching sobbing, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I called for backup, but something told me I couldn't wait. Maybe it was the way the sound cut right through me. Maybe it was just instinct. I tried the door. Unlocked. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around the entryway. The crying got louder as soon as I crossed the threshold. "Police, hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just that awful sound, now echoing through the empty house. The place was a mess. Junk everywhere, rotting food on the counters, an unmistakable smell of decay. I followed the sound upstairs, where it was louder. My flashlight beam swept over empty picture frames on the walls and peeling wallpaper. I swear to God, it felt like the house was breathing, like it was alive. At the top of the stairs, I saw it. A bedroom door was cracked open, and the crying was coming from inside. My hand was on my gun now. I called out again, but I already knew no one was going to answer. I pushed the door open. The first thing I saw was a figure sitting on the floor, back to me. Long, tangled hair, thin arms wrapped around trembling knees. She was rocking back and forth, crying into her hands. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I stepped closer. My flashlight caught something on the floor next to her, clothes covered in dark, dried stains. She stopped crying. She didn't turn around, didn't even flinch. But the second I spoke, she just stopped. The room went dead silent. And then she stood up. When she turned to face me, my flashlight caught her eyes. Wide, bloodshot, empty. I'll never forget the way she smiled at me. Not a normal smile. This was something else. Her teeth were stained red. That's when I saw the rest of the room. In the corner, partially hidden by a pile of blankets, was what was left of a man. Or at least most of him. I drew my gun, yelled for her to get on the ground, but she didn't move. She just stared at me with that smile, swaying slightly, like she was waiting for something. Backup arrived a few minutes later. By the time they got to the room, she was sitting back on the floor, sobbing like before, like nothing had happened. Turns out, the man on the floor was her husband. She'd killed him 2 weeks earlier, beaten him to death with a hammer, and had been living with the body ever since. The crying, she did it every night, like a performance. But here's the part I can't shake. When we arrested her, she leaned in close and whispered, "He's still here, you know." I don't believe in ghosts, but every time I think about that house, about her voice, I can't help but wonder what she really meant. You clicked on this video. You gave me a shot, even though my channel is small, and for that, I'm beyond grateful. So here's my promise to you. Stick around, and I won't let you down. Got an idea for a new scary story? Be the first to comment, and I'll write the next one exactly how you want it. That's my way of saying thanks. Now turn the lights down, and let's get into it. This is a ride you won't forget. I've seen a lot in my years on the force, things I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever gotten under my skin like the Johnson house call. It was late, just past midnight, when the call came in. A man reported hearing screams from his neighbor's house. He claimed it had been going on for hours, like someone was being tortured. I thought it was probably an exaggeration. People get paranoid in the dead of night. But when I pulled up to the house, I knew something wasn't right. The place was quiet, too quiet. Lights off, curtains drawn, not a single sound except for the faint creak of tree branches in the wind. I knocked on the door and announced myself. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. That's when I heard it. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I called for backup, but the wait felt like forever. My gut was screaming at me that someone needed help, and every second wasted could mean life or death. Against protocol, I forced the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was overwhelming, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, acidic. My flashlight illuminated the living room. Filthy carpet, broken furniture, walls covered in peeling paint. And then I saw the stains. Dark, brownish red stains smeared across the floor in wide arcs, leading to the hallway. Police, is anyone here? My voice sounded small in the silence, and then I heard it. A faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the hallway, though. It was behind me. I spun around, gun drawn, but the living room was empty. Just shadows. For a moment, I thought I was losing it. But then the whisper came again. This time, I could make out words. Help me. The voice was weak, barely audible, and it was coming from the basement door. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. I didn't want to go down there, but I had no choice. Someone needed me. The stairs groaned under my weight as I made my way down, my flashlight cutting through the pitch black. The smell was worse here, thick and suffocating. Halfway down, my foot hit something soft. I looked down and nearly gagged. It was a stuffed animal, a rabbit, covered in dirt, and something else I didn't want to identify. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of my flashlight caught something on the floor. At first, I thought it was a bundle of clothes, but then I saw the hand. It was a child, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were open, staring blankly at nothing. But she wasn't alone. Standing in the corner, just outside the reach of my flashlight, was a figure, a man. His back was to me, and he was completely still, as if he hadn't even noticed I was there. He was holding something in his hands, a long, thin knife, glinting faintly in the light. "Put the weapon down," I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't move. He just stood there, breathing heavily. And then he turned his head, just enough for me to see his face. I've never seen eyes like that. Wide, unblinking, filled with something that wasn't human. His mouth twisted into a grin so big it looked like it hurt. "I was waiting for you," he said. He dropped the knife and sprinted toward me, faster than I thought possible. I fired twice. He dropped at my feet, blood pooling around him, but the grin never left his face. Backup arrived minutes later, but it felt like an eternity. The girl was long gone. She'd been dead for days. And the man, he was identified as a drifter who'd been squatting in the house, abducting children from nearby neighborhoods. The case was closed, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, because I swear I hear whispers. Help me. I got the call just after 2 a.m. A couple staying at a remote campground reported screaming in the woods. They sounded shaken, claiming it had been going on for hours. It's not unusual to get calls like that. Wild animals can make terrifying noises in the middle of the night. But something in their voices set me on edge. The campground was a good 40-minute drive into the forest, pitch black the whole way. My headlights cut through the dense trees, but it felt like the darkness was swallowing everything else. When I finally arrived, the couple who made the call were waiting for me at the entrance, pale and trembling. "It's not animals," the man insisted, gripping my arm. It sounded human. I tried to reassure them, but I wasn't sure I believed my own words. As I headed into the forest with my flashlight and radio, the couple refused to follow, staying behind in their car with the doors locked. The woods were silent at first, but the deeper I went, the more oppressive it felt. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, the crunch of leaves and twigs echoing in the stillness. And then I heard it. A scream. It was faint, far away, but unmistakable. A woman's scream, high-pitched and panicked. My heart started racing as I picked up my pace, my flashlight swinging wildly as I scanned the trees. "Police, call out if you can hear me," I shouted. The scream came again, closer this time. My chest tightened. It didn't sound like someone crying for help. It sounded like raw, primal terror. I broke into a jog, the beam of my flashlight dancing across the forest floor. That's when I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, illuminated by the faint glow of a dying campfire. The campsite was a mess. A tent had been shredded, its fabric hanging in strips from the branches. Clothes and belongings were scattered everywhere. The fire pit was still smoldering, but there was no one around. And then I saw the blood. It was splattered across the ground, leading away from the campsite in a haphazard trail. My stomach dropped. I followed it cautiously, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn back. The trail led to another clearing, smaller than the first. In the center was a tree, and at the base of that tree was a figure. A woman, sitting with her back against the trunk, her head tilted down so her hair obscured her face. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, my flashlight revealing more details. Her clothes were torn, her arms and legs covered in scratches. The blood trail led right to her, pooling beneath her body. "Ma'am, I'm here to help," I said, inching closer. She moved. It was a subtle shift, just enough for me to notice her fingers twitching. Relief washed over me. She was alive. But when I got closer, something didn't feel right. Her breathing was shallow, almost non-existent, and her head still hung low, like she didn't have the strength to lift it. "Are you alone out here?" "What happened?" I asked. Slowly, she raised her head. Her eyes met mine, and I swear to God I've never seen fear like that. Her pupils were blown wide, tears streaming down her face, and she was shaking violently. Her lips moved, but the words were barely audible. "He's still here," she whispered. I froze. The next sound I heard was the crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the trees, but I didn't see anything. My radio crackled. Backup was on its way, but they were still 20 minutes out. The woman started sobbing, her cries growing louder and more frantic. "Don't let him take me," she begged, clutching at my arm. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall and gaunt, dressed in filthy clothes. His face was pale, almost corpse-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to gleam in the dark. In his hand was a hunting knife, the blade catching the light of my flashlight. "Drop the weapon," I barked, drawing my gun. He didn't react. He just tilted his head like he was studying me, and then he smiled, a wide, crooked grin that made my blood run cold. The woman screamed, and before I could react, he bolted back into the woods. Backup arrived minutes later. We searched the area, but he was gone, vanished, like he'd never been there. The woman was taken to the hospital, and I stayed behind to process the scene. We later found out that she'd been camping with her boyfriend. His body was discovered 2 days later, deep in the woods, mutilated beyond recognition. The man who attacked them, we never caught him. Sometimes late at night, I think about that smile, and I wonder how many others have seen it before their time ran out. It started with a 911 call from a gas station attendant. A man had pulled in around 11 p.m., acting erratic, pacing back and forth, sweating through his shirt, and mumbling to himself. The attendant said he looked scared out of his mind, like he was running from something. But it wasn't until the man left that the attendant noticed the blood dripping from the trunk of his car. When I caught up to the car 15 minutes later, it was parked on the shoulder of a back road. The driver was sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, not moving. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. I tapped on the window, and he jumped like I'd fired a gun. He rolled it down, just a crack, and I could see his eyes, wide, bloodshot, darting back and forth like a cornered animal. "Sir, is everything all right? We got a report that..." "It's not mine," he blurted out, cutting me off. "What's not yours?" "The blood," he whispered. Now, I've dealt with my share of nervous drivers, people with warrants, DUIs, drugs in the car. But this guy wasn't nervous. He was terrified. "Step out of the car, sir," I ordered. He hesitated, his hand shaking as he fumbled with the door handle. When he finally got out, I could see his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his legs wobbled like they might give out. "Open the trunk," I said. He froze. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand. I didn't do it. I just found it." "Open the trunk," I repeated, my hand hovering near my holster. He didn't argue. He shuffled to the back of the car, his whole body trembling, and popped the trunk. The stench hit me before I even saw it, thick, metallic, and unmistakable. My flashlight illuminated the inside of the trunk, and for a moment, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. It was a body, a young woman, mid-20s, crammed inside like discarded luggage. Her skin was pale, her neck at an unnatural angle, and her clothes were soaked in blood. But that wasn't the worst part. Her eyes were open. They were wide, glassy, and staring right at me. And her mouth was twisted into this grotesque, frozen scream. Like whatever happened to her, she died in absolute terror. I staggered back, trying to keep my dinner down. The driver sank to his knees, sobbing, muttering over and over. I didn't do it, he screamed. "Whose car is this?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I intended. It's my brother's," he stammered. He gave it to me last night, said he didn't need it anymore." The pieces started clicking into place. "Where's your brother now?" He didn't answer. He just kept shaking his head, mumbling something I couldn't make out. Backup arrived a few minutes later, and we brought the man in for questioning. But that's not where the story ends. The next day, we tracked down his brother at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. When we got to the room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, it was chaos. Broken furniture, blood smeared on the walls, and a strong smell of bleach. We found him in the bathtub. He'd slit his wrists and written something on the bathroom mirror in his own blood. Just 3 words. "She's still screaming." Autopsy reports confirmed the woman in the trunk had been dead for at least 24 hours before the driver even got the car. But here's the thing I can't explain. The gas station's security camera footage. In the video, you can see the car parked at the pump. You can see the driver pacing, sweating, losing his mind. But if you look closely, you can also see the trunk. And in one frame, just one frame, you can see her face pressed against the inside of the glass, her mouth open, still screaming.